Welcome back to another episode of Revenue Optimization Radio, hosted by Patrick Morrissey, Chief Marketing Officer at Altify. Revenue Optimization Radio is brought to you by Altify, the sales transformation company. Where we believe the only way to unlock sustained growth is to deliver predictable revenue. Delivering insights, thought leadership, and the best practice on how to improve sales velocity. From the one man, maybe the only man who knows how to do all of that, at least this morning, Patrick Morrissey. Hey, Patrick.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone, and thanks once again for joining us for another edition of the Revenue Optimization Radio podcast. As you know, we talk a lot about how do you deliver value for clients and how do you actually use that focus on customers, what they need, how do you drive outcomes to drive the better and more repeatable business value for yourself and for your organization. And I'm excited to have somebody join us today who's really thought about this subject deeply and really can bring the idea of a plan to help the customer generate outcomes to life in the form of account planning. We're joined today by Helen Harwood, and Helen is a partner in Harwood Partners, LLC, and she is just a dynamic coach, leader, executive, helping revenue leaders and their teams drive outcomes for their customers. Helen, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm happy to be here.
I'm thrilled to have you on because I think you're right in the middle of something that seems to be gaining more and more attention. And that is account planning is one of the core elements of optimizing revenue and driving outcome for clients. But before we get into it, give us a little bit of background on you, your clientele, your expertise, and then we'll dive in.
I have been selling for quite some time and sold for companies like Xerox, Siebel, Gartner, and today for Altify. So I'm a seller as well as a consultant working for Altify for some time. The type of clients that I've worked with as a seller have included many high-tech companies, along with in the federal space, the U.S. Navy and other Department of Defense clients.
Well, actually, that's great context because I think we may want to touch on it a little bit of the what's the same and what's different in selling to public sector clients, and certainly in the defense space, that's one level of deeper expertise. But I really want to start with the headline level around account planning. There's a recent piece of research out from Gartner entitled or report talking about why accounts aren't growing, and the stat that they lead off with that I think really paints the picture that most organizations struggle with is that they're reporting that only 28% of sales leaders indicate that account management is helping them really grow revenue, or said differently, 72% of organizations aren't executing on the expand part of the model that we all take as assumptive. Whether you're in financial services or technology, or you're selling to the public sector, or you're selling to commercial accounts, the bias that most enterprise sales organizations have is we're going to spend a lot of energy on landing in an account, and then we're really going to drive outcomes and we're going to drive performance and we're going to maximize that revenue because we all know it should be easier to sell to an existing customer than it is to find a new one. What Gartner is saying is, sounds great, not working in actual practice. In fact, the quote here is from a sales VP that they talk about is, the potential for cross-sell and portfolio expansion with our clients has never been higher, but we just can't seem to execute. And I think that's a pretty good summary around this topic to kick into the conversations. Let's start at the beginning. One, does that ring true to you? And number two, why is this such a big problem? Why is it so hard?
It absolutely rings true to me, and I see that often in the clients that I work with. I think there are two reasons for this. I think the first reason is the tendency to stay in a certain pocket inside an account where you feel comfortable, where you feel your customers, where they're friendly. It's harder to branch out and try to discover new areas in the account, whether they be business units, as we call it in business, or in the federal space, new departments or areas in the account. An example I can give on this is in the defense space, it's common that organizations will hire former military to come in with the idea that they will have contacts that will help them expand the business. What they find often is those retired military tend to go in the areas where they worked before. And so if you look at an organization as large as the U.S. Navy, if someone came from the Naval Air Command, they could be very good at driving business in that area, yet leave the other 90% of the Navy untouched. So do we really understand what the potential is in the account? The second reason is as sellers, we often misunderstand or don't take the time to understand what our customers' business priorities are. Do we know what goals they're trying to achieve? Do we understand the issues that they have to face that are getting in the way of their success? And do we understand what sort of initiatives they're putting into place to overcome those? And can we identify from that what is it that we could align ourselves and bring value? So if we can take a broader look at the organizations we're selling in, get outside the pocket or the area where we currently have a presence, and try to analyze that account as a whole, and then prioritize where are there certain business conditions or initiatives where we could actually bring value.
You're hitting on a whole bunch of things that there's some real depth. So let me rewind a little bit to the first thing you talked about, which is potential in the account. And you used the Navy example, but I've seen this countless times in my career that we bring in somebody who's done a great job of selling to Citigroup or Wells Fargo and assume that they have a big Rolodex, right? And assume that they're going to be able to produce a result because they think they know people. Oftentimes that may in fact be the case. They have some detail about the account. They understand some of who's who in the zoo, but they really don't necessarily understand broadly beyond just the people they know what's important. And to the second piece you also mentioned is what kind of outcomes are they looking for? Is that a common mistake? Or I would think that in the world of science, if you buy the idea that sales is a science, it's more about the second piece of unpacking what are the customer priorities would be the critical issue. But still, there's a lot of organizations, particularly as they go vertical, they're trying to hire the people with the big Rolodex.
Mm-hmm. I can think of an example. A senior partner at a major consulting firm was selling to Procter & Gamble, and they had excellent revenue growth. They were one of the highest income producing teams inside this consulting firm. And when we looked and we conducted an account planning session for this team working with Procter & Gamble, what we mapped out or what we saw was they were achieving spectacular year-over-year growth. But when we looked at what the overall potential by mapping out Procter & Gamble as an organization, what we saw was all that success was focused on one area within Procter & Gamble. When we analyzed what their total potential is, what sort of wallet share they could potentially get, there was a lot of money being left on the table. And it certainly was the best strategy to step back from what we were doing and look at where should we focus to generate new revenue streams.
Yeah, and that's a great example because I think you're keying in on a couple points here. One is, in my experience, the people who are really strong strategic sellers and have built really successful careers already have account planning as part of the muscle they've already built and part of the strategy they undertake. But what you're emphasizing is, even if I'm a top seller, if I really can't step back and understand the surface area and find the white space, I'm probably leaving a lot of opportunity on the table.
And in this example, this partner's success was actually getting in the way of achieving potential. He was so successful in this area, he was bringing in a lot of revenue, but he totally had misjudged what his overall potential could be. And that might go back to what you said from the Gartner study of not achieving what your overall wallet share could be inside an account.
And I think that's the steady state for most people. And it comes back to the second point you raised about the importance of account planning is really trying to get to what is the customer trying to get done? What's the outcome you can start to achieve? If you apply that in this situation, how often do you see organizations really being successful in being able to diagnose the true needs of the customer at an account level? And what are the barriers that get in the way of trying to bring the customer into the center and to understand them and get really deep into high fidelity with what's important to them, which informs what we could position?
One of the biggest new tools that I've been using and am happy to share with my clients is a tool inside of Altify called the Insight Map. That's kind of a logical way to lay out your understanding of an organization's goals based on research you do, based on your history with the account and the people you know in the account. And it gives you the opportunity to map out as much as you do understand. But that's only part of it. The next part is going in with the client and sharing your understanding with the client and getting them to put their input in, because it's really their vision that's important, not yours. But the insight map gives you a great foundation for that conversation and helps you build that credibility within the client organization. The next step is, of course, when you start to understand what that company's priorities are, you need to identify who are the leaders inside that organization that are responsible for those priorities. And then how do you start to build out the political landscape and identify what relationships do we need to make that we don't already have.
I find sometimes that even for very experienced senior sales or sales leaders, they seem to be a little bit reticent or sometimes just flat out afraid to put their insights back in front of the customer about what they've learned. And what I thought I heard you say is, hey, you need to sit down with the customer and actually walk through, this is what we understand about you. Why do you see that as being a problem?
Well, I think traditionally, and a common approach was to go into a client and say, tell me about your business. Tell me what keeps you up at night. In today's environment, customers really expect that you're going to understand their business. You have so many ways to do research and understand their business. So I think they really respect when you take the time to try to map out your understanding the best that you can. And then that starts the conversation off at a much higher level. It demonstrates your interest and it demonstrates your credibility. They certainly don't expect it to be perfect. Very gladly jump in and say, that's wrong. No, actually, we need to get that done by 2020. No, actually, we've revised that revenue projection. We're really trying to hit 20 billion, not 22 billion. That they really get in and start working with you and clarifying, expanding, disputing what your original understanding is. And, you walk away with a much better tool set in order to figure out, do I have services and solutions that can actually support what they're trying to achieve?
So what would be a good example in your experience of the difference between I'm trying to sell something to you versus I'm trying to understand what's important to you and what are you trying to get done? That would frame new potential opportunities for me to diagnose that, because account planning is fundamentally about finding new opportunities.
Okay, yeah, I have a great example. So in the business that we're in with Altify, trying to help organizations maximize their revenue, optimize their revenue, our assumption is always that sales leaders, I typically talk to an EVP of sales, that's my target contact in an account. And I can generally go in with the assumption that they want to grow their revenue by a certain percentage or hit a particular revenue number. But I went in recently to talk to a sales leader. And as we sat down and kind of went over my insight map where I had the assumption of revenue growth, he quickly corrected me and said, yeah, actually, we've been really successful bringing in new clients, bringing in revenue to the organization. The problem I'm trying to fix right now is our retention rate. And our retention rate is about 5 points below what our industry average should be. So my major objective for 2019, 2020 is to get my retention rate up to 93%. That's what I'm shooting for. How can you help us do that?
And I think that goes back to the point you were raising a second ago in terms of understanding the organization and really mapping out the people, because you both got, in that example you just gave, a hard target in terms of dollar or percentage or moving the needle that's material to the customer in this case. The other thing you're talking about, and I think it's important to emphasize here, is that's this person's personal goal, right? There's the business element of this, and there's also, how do you make me successful, which feels like it gets missed sometimes.
Exactly. Well, again, you have to understand, how are they being measured? And one of the problems that I think sellers often encounter is they're not selling to the right people. So if I'm selling at a different level in the organization, that might not be their metric. It could be that their metric is they're trying to schedule 3 workshops for July and they're looking for the lowest cost vendor. That is not the person that I want to sell to. I want to understand who's responsible for business outcomes. Because if you're talking about business outcomes, then the cost of your product and service doesn't become the issue. You want to make sure that you're focused on what you can do for the business leaders who are actually holding the targets for the success of the organization. Understanding who the right people are is critical. And a lot of sellers are either uncomfortable about, quote, going over someone's head, or they're just uncomfortable talking to what they consider to be high-level executives. They seem to have the idea that they're not qualified to do that, which I try to dissuade them of that thought because they are experts in their field. They do know their solutions. They shouldn't be very familiar with their industry. They should be able to share ideas on how other companies are approaching solving the problems that their client has. And again, I think the Insight Map is such a great tool to give the seller that confidence and to build the credibility with the right level in the client organization.
Terrific. So let's pause right there for a second to pay the bills, and I want to pick back up on people when we come back.
You're only as successful as your customers, and that demands the need for an exceptional sales execution, revenue retention, and customer success. The challenge for most sales leaders and their teams, however, is that their sales process just doesn't match how their customers buy. Sustained growth isn't possible because the revenue team isn't aligned with customers and prospects. With Altify's sales transformation solutions, companies can deliver predictable revenue growth. Yes, we said predictable revenue growth. They can also acquire and retain customers, and they can collaborate across the revenue team to qualify and win new business while delivering value that unlocks cross-sell and upsell opportunities. Built natively on the Salesforce platform, Altify helps salespeople, managers, and executives achieve sustained revenue growth. They help accelerate sales performance for Autodesk, Comcast, GE, Honeywell, Salesforce, Tableau, and United Healthcare. They can do the same for you. Visit Altify.com, just like it sounds, Altify, Altify.com.
Welcome back, everyone. We're talking to Helen Harwood about what does good look like in revenue optimization, and more specifically about how do you generate more revenue in existing accounts with account planning. And Helen, you were just commenting a second ago about the need or the challenge sometimes around relationships in that sales reps, sales teams are talking to the wrong people. And part of this gets down to how do you actually manage and develop an influence strategy. But I think there's even a more important element here when I think about complex sales that in places like, financial services or healthcare, where you might have really large teams selling variations of products to different business units or completely different products, and they all don't share the same understanding of a customer. That would suggest to me, to your earlier point, that there's a lot of potential there, or there's a lot of money being left on the table because there's not a unifying approach to the customer and what's important. Mm-hmm. Is that a fair assessment?
That's absolutely a fair assessment. And as a matter of fact, I was just working with a client this week. It's a $200 billion a year revenue. They're in the Fortune 50. And they have a large number of distinct sales organizations representing different products and services, and they all are acting independently. That creates confusion with the customer. It also means there's probably missed opportunities internally with sharing and leveraging information that they could share with each other. What they're doing right now is they are setting up an account planning process. They're trying to take all that account related information and incorporate it into Salesforce using the Altify platform to make that information more available across the various sales teams. This is going to be a process. It's not immediate. You've got various, sometimes different instances of Salesforce where they can't even access that information. But the long-term view is how can we bring all the sellers together? How can we share information across the selling enterprise? And I think as important, how do we have a consistent value proposition? Communicating the value that we're delivering to our client that sounds consistent across the various units. And I applaud them for moving in that direction. And I also respect that it is a process and you can't immediately fix that situation that you described.
Well, it is a process as well as it's an ongoing effort. You're never done with account planning, I think is one of the challenges I observe the mental blocks for organizations, because account planning, particularly if it's been done poorly, and we've probably all seen this, it's an artificial one and done exercise that happens at the beginning of the year, and then it goes into a drawer and nobody ever looks at it again. Then we all block and tackle our way through the fiscal year, and then it comes back up again because we know it's supposed to happen. Kind of like we know we were supposed to go to the gym this morning, doesn't mean it's part of our standard cadence. It's not on the calendar, right? So when you step back and you engage, like the example you were just giving with a really large organization who is fairly new in account planning, what are the foundational strategic and tactical elements to start to think about to bring account planning to life?
Well, one is to have a common lexicon or playbook that goes across the enterprise. So the terminology is the same, the process is the same for communicating information. Having the relevant information available, you're of course familiar with the relationship mapping in Altify, which allows us to capture not only who the people are, but what the political landscape is, who has power, who has influence, who are we actually talking to? So if I'm in selling for one business unit, if I can have access to my counterparts' relationship map and see where they have contacts and compare that with where I do, maybe there's an opportunity that I can leverage my colleagues' relationships to help elevate mine and vice versa. So I think you reference the one and done approach to account planning, which usually resulted in a 3-ring binder that went on a shelf. If you're able to integrate that planning process into your CRM, you're able to make that an everyday part of people's work process. And the way we're able to manage objectives and actions and allocate specific tasks across a large sales team and then be able to keep track of the progress of that really enhances it, staying alive and staying relevant and staying updated so that the information is current and supports your sales efforts.
So let me play that back to you to make sure I've got it, because I think what you're effectively suggesting is that there's 3 core elements here. One is getting on the same page about the client and their needs. The second thing is understanding the relationships. And the third thing is making it actionable and including the broad team. And I think that, and you mentioned, Salesforce earlier, getting it captured. It seems like one of the core pieces of the puzzle is to get not just the sales leaders who know this is a good idea, but the entire extended team into an action orientation that looks like objectives that are time bound and are driving specific outcomes.
You're exactly right. That's it in a nutshell.
And when you think about the action orientation there, do you ever find that, have you ever encountered client situations where they're already doing the actions and they already have insight? Or what of those 3 buckets between, actions across the team, client insight and relationships, where do you find the biggest jump comes in terms of the initial cycles of account planning? Where are the big ahas when you start to engage and start to move teams into this kind of a rhythm and this kind of an approach?
Well, I think there's an aha in each of those 3. In insight, it's really understanding the customer's business, but getting the customer to collaborate. So in insight, it's collaborating with the customer. On the relationship landscape, I think it's our focus of maintaining and continuing with the relationships we have and not look at the relationships that could be. When I analyze sellers' relationship maps, I see that all the information is filled in about each individual, which means they're including in their relationship map the people they already know. So I want to know, well, who do they report to and who do they report to? And you may not be calling on the CEO, but do you know who that is? And often they don't. And so I think that's really important to get the full picture of the leadership of an organization. And then around, when you talk about actions, I find people often confuse the difference between actions and objectives. We'll have actions like call Tom Smith by June 15th. That's an action, but why do you want to do that? What are you trying to achieve in that account? Are you trying to expand relationships at the senior level? And if you are, what sort of metric are you going to use to measure that? Is that going to be a face-to-face appointment with the EVP of sales by June 15th? Set what your objective is, what you're trying to accomplish, and then what are the actions I need to take to get there? I think if you don't put the actions in the context of what you're trying to achieve, you're often staying busy doing activities, but not necessarily moving the needle in achieving what your overall business goal is.
I completely agree with you. And I think what you just said is really powerful because it's very easy and for sales leaders and executives to roll up forecasts and they're looking for behavior that just end up being tasks. versus what you're pointing to here is what is the measurable outcome that is going to drive a series of activities and tasks to get to a result. And what you're suggesting here is, very powerfully, is it's not just about having a call or doing an action or having a task. It's about focusing on an outcome, putting a specific metric around it, and using that to frame a series of activities that the team may take to try to advance.
Yeah, absolutely. As a partner with Altify, I'm 100% commission. And so I have to be very careful on how I invest my time. And so to have a methodology, to have a process, to help me think through my business, my portfolio of accounts, my portfolio of prospects, it helps me really understand what are my business objectives and then say, what are the actions I need to do to achieve them?
I think that is a good first principle because I was just listening to something the other day where the net of it, I think that came from Tom Peters, was you are your calendar. If you're not really focused about what's important and what you're doing, then there's a lot of missed opportunity left on the table.
When I started selling for Xerox, and I was very successful from the start. And I was generally number one or number two in our region. They kept a whiteboard with the stack rankings. The person that I was always jockeying with for first place was the difference between us was I was working 60-hour weeks. I was working weekends. I was working all the time. He hardly ever worked, always had a great tan, great golf game, was always talking about his vacations. And finally, after a year, I said, what is it? How do you get the results by working so little? His answer was, I've been watching you, Helen, for the past year. And what I see is you're running around doing everything. I just focus on the deals that are going to close. I just focus on what's going to generate revenue for me. And I find that saves me a lot of time. So I did go ahead and marry him. And that's another story.
That is called closing the deal.
Yeah, that's called closing the deal.
Well done. And that's probably a good segue as we wrap up here. When you think back on your career, both as a seller as well as a consultant to senior sales leaders, what's an example of a great sales or revenue leader you've worked with that really sticks out to you, and what did you learn from them?
Best sales leader that I worked for was when I was working for Craig Sawicki at Altify. He was the partner manager at the time I came on board as a partner. And Craig leads through example, and helps to bring out the best in each of you. We're all different. We all have our different strengths and weaknesses. And what I observed about Craig with both myself and my counterparts is he was able to understand what aspect of their selling style was going to generate success and help nurture and develop that, versus trying to mold people into a generic or a kind of a cookie cutter type mold. And I learned so much from him in that way, as well as just observing the way he interacted with the clients. So that was a real opportunity for me to learn from Craig.
Really appreciate that feedback, Helen. Thank you for the insights. And if people who are listening want to reach out to you to get some help on strategy or thinking through the art of the possible with revenue optimization and account planning, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
You can reach me through my email, which is harwood@harwoodpartnership.com.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing your time and your insights. The idea of, I think, focusing on client outcomes that you talked about very directly maps directly to the headline about how to make it actionable at the end, which is it's got to be tied to an objective, it's got to be tied to a metric, and it's got to be tied to a series of behaviors to drive an outcome. So thank you for sharing your insight, and I'll let you get back to driving outcomes for your clients. Have a fantastic week.
Thank you, Patrick.
Take care.
You've been listening to another episode of Revenue Optimization Radio, brought to you by Altify, right here on the Funnel Radio Network for at-work listeners like you.